Oh, g'day legends. Nice to see you here, and especially on a Saturday night. How lucky are we? But today we have something very special to go over and something that we haven't seen before. The New York Times has just published not only a piece, but also all the documents from some peace negotiations that have taken place very early in this war. And we're going to go over it in complete, and we'll look at what New York Times has said. We'll look at the actual documents itself, and bear with me, I've only read it a couple of times, and we'll go over it and see what I think and see where some sticking points may have been. But why is this important now? Well, firstly, we haven't seen it in a couple of years, but also the Peace Summit starts today in Switzerland, Ukraine's peace conference that has many, many nations there. Of course, not Russia and China, but we have seen that Russia, we think, is trying to land as many blows as possible to discredit then this conference. Now, of course, it's published by the New York Times, but we saw only yesterday then Putin then announce a peace deal that he is happy to strike, and we'll talk about that. But of course, New York Times has released this not to be in some pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin way, but of course to line news up with news, because clicks then sell. And with this leaking of the 22 agreement, we did wonder why the terms of this were never released. We'll go through that today. Now, Ukraine has said that what Russia wanted was so ridiculous that that's why then they walked away from those deals. And that is interesting. So we see then Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, has said this. He argued the respective positions were so far away and the Russian demands were so bizarre that the prospect of a real solution was not even remotely in sight. But we'll look at what those actually were and how far away do we think this was. And this is the latest terms, dating then the 15th of April, when one of the main sticking points was see the guarantor states. But we will talk about this in length, and something from a friend of mine as well. So we'll go over then everything. I think one of the first important things to look at is, what did the maps look like at that time? What did or didn't Russia occupy? So let's have a look at that. And we date back, and this is the 15th of April, 2022. Now, we'll pull up the map of today next to it, but some differences. So, of course, we see the south is looking very, very similar. But of course, one area, Kherson, of course, where Russia had occupied on the right bank, that is significantly different, shown in green now on this map. Now, the south itself, Zapoblast, realistically not that much different. We know that's where Ukraine's 23 counteroffensive was, but as far as large ground here, not too different. Then we'll come up into Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast, and this is where we start seeing some changes, of course, Avdiivka. So we see on this black line is since 2014. Now we can see everything beyond the purple here in this region here was made since this, as well as out from, to the south of Severodonetsk in Luhansk Oblast. But you can see as well then the Kharkiv Oblast here, of course, we can see looks significantly different, with at the end of 22, Ukraine took back a hell of a lot of land in here. Very similar time than what we saw then here that we saw down in Kherson. So this is where the differences are on the maps. Is it a complete 50% difference of this or that? No, because Russia's made some in areas, Ukraine has made some in areas. The net change, well, I can't tell you off the bat, but it's probably not that much when we're talking 100% of the nation. So I think that's an important area to start. But let's look at the article. New York Times, Ukraine-Russia peace is as elusive as ever. But in 2022, they were talking, and this is the full article here. You can find them both in Russian and English. With Russia and Ukraine locked in their third year of all-out war, there is no clear path to military victory for either side, nor are there immediate prospects for a ceasefire and an eventual peace plan, with both sides sticking to irreconcilable positions. Yet the issues that would need to be tackled in any future peace settlement are evident. And in fact, they were at the center of negotiations 2 years ago. Now, no matter how this war ends, there's still going to need to be some diplomatic solution signed at the end of this and agreements. And like I always say, we don't know yet how this is going to end. Today, even with hundreds of thousands dead and wounded, Moscow and Kyiv appear further from any peace than any time since the full-scale invasion. On Friday, Mr. Putin said Russia would agree to a ceasefire only if Ukraine handed over 4 regions. Those regions are then, of course, Kherson, Zap, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Of course, the 4 regions along here. They essentially demand for capitulation because, of course, Russia doesn't occupy the full amount of those, but does occupy the majority. Ukraine's current demands are withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory also appear unrealistic given Mr. Putin's apparent resolve and his army's current advantage. Russia currently does have the initiative and the advantage on the battlefield in terms of manpower, artillery system, and we can see this on the map as Russia every day for the past few months has been chipping away at bits of ground. Of course, we know the peace conference in Switzerland is on this weekend. Of course, this is why it has lined up. A scenario is expected to be discussed as Ukraine gathers scores of countries, though not Russia, and I'll add in here, not China, for peace conference in Switzerland this weekend. If and when Ukraine and Russia resume direct negotiations, the issues raised in the documents produced at the start of the war, including the status of occupied Ukrainian territories and Ukraine's future security guarantees, would remain relevant. Now, we will be going through all of the article, just bear with me, it sets up. The Times is publishing documents obtained in full. The documents were provided by Ukrainian, Russian, and European sources, confirmed as authentic. Many spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorised to discuss the negotiations. We can see why. We managed to find a very real compromise. We were very close in the middle of April, the end of April, to finalise our war with some peaceful settlement, a member of the Ukrainian negotiating team. Ukraine made a significant concession. It was ready to become a permanent neutral state. We'll talk about that at whole. Ukraine sought Russia's assent to international security guarantees by which other countries, including Ukrainian allies, would also sign the agreement and would come to its defence should it be attacked. These are the guarantor states. And if it were attacked, they could come in, close the airspace, provide necessary weapons using armed forces in order to restore and subsequently maintain the security of Ukraine. We'll talk about that because that seems to be the big sticking point. The draft includes limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. We'll look at that. A former senior US official who was briefed in negotiations, noting how Russian forces were being repelled across northern Ukraine, said Mr. Putin seemed to be salivating at the deal. American officials were alarmed at the terms in meetings with Ukrainian counterparts. A senior official recalled, "We quietly said, you understand this is unilateral disarmament." Now, a breakthrough in Istanbul. So this came later on, March 29th, that after each military setback, a member of Ukraine's negotiating team said Mr. Putin reduced his demands. Continuing. The status of Crimea was to be decided over a 10 or 15-year period with Ukraine, promising not to try and retake the peninsula by force. Very interesting bit. Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin would meet in person to finalise a peace treaty and strike a deal on how much Ukrainian territory Russia would continue to occupy. Now, interestingly, in this article, as well as when we go through the full documents, there's no mention about Donetsk and Luhansk, although there is a lot of talk about sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. So we're not exactly sure what would happen with these areas. And without the maps, it's very hard to tell what would. But it is worth noting that both Luhansk and Donetsk, pre the February 22 invasion, were not occupied officially by Russian forces. So that's interestingly to put in there as well. So it does seem that they may have gone back to Ukraine, back to Russia, and then there would be some condition there. And Kyiv Independent has reported the status of occupied territories would be concluded during later talks between President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. So the occupied areas of what we showed on the map, it would be made at a later date after the guns had fallen silent. The sovereignty, integrity, and security was guaranteed from then the guarantor states. In early April, after Russia withdrew from the outskirts of Kyiv, images of massacred civilians in the suburb of Bucha, some with their hands tied in white cloth, shocked the world. For Ukrainians, the idea that their country could strike a compromise and Russia seemed more remote than ever. But Mr. Zelensky, visiting Bucha on April the 4th, said the talks would go on, even as Russia dismissed the Bucha atrocities as a staged provocation. So it wasn't this that then halted the talks, as some say. Negotiators agreed Ukraine would declare itself permanently neutral, though it would be allowed to join the European Union. So this is in a part, we'll look at this in full, status as a permanent neutral state, subject to provisions of this treaty compatible with Ukraine's possible membership in the EU. So Russia was not against that, but of course things like NATO are different. Now, of course, a Swiss resort this weekend, Zelensky has put together 100 countries for the peace conference that is going on. Russia and China will not be present. Russia was not invited. China said it didn't meet their requirements, which their requirement is that Russia's there. If we don't make progress this year, then we'll try again next year, Mr. Zelensky privately told a European counterpart recently. And if we don't make progress next year, we'll try again the following year and the one after that. So this forever war, although we have seen the US say we don't want another Afghanistan, and as well, the longer the war goes on, we know the more and more people that will die in this. Mr. Putin in recent months stepped up his efforts to stroke Western divisions, portraying peace as having been within reach in 2022, saying he was prepared to restart those talks. We have seen Zelensky say this, although Ukraine's foreign ministry said in a statement, Putin is a habitual liar and his recent rants are no exception. Mr. Putin shifted to a harder line on Friday, insisting that he would order a ceasefire and negotiate only if Ukraine withdrew from the 4 regions that we spoke about previously. Even before Putin's latest demand, experts said it was hard to imagine going back to the kind of deal discussed in 2022. Ukraine is more determined than ever to join NATO. Of course, in this deal, as you'll see, not part of it. Instead, the more likely end of fighting could be an uneasy truce. Mark Wheeler, a Cambridge international law professor who specialises in peace negotiations, he has said, the Iron Curtain will now fall in the line of occupation administered by the Russians across Ukraine, saying again, more likely to end fighting could be an uneasy truce. And we've spoken about this, that we think the most likely scenario is probably along this line here somewhere. But this isn't about me. We'll talk at length about that. And we'll look at the annexes, the sticking points, and of course then the guarantor status in this. So this is the full article. This is very easy to find. Be on the Telegram if you'd like to go and see it. So dated 15th April 2022. Position of the Russian Federation not agreed upon by the Ukrainian side. Position of the Ukrainian side not agreed upon by the Russian Federation. So we don't know how far along this actually was, but what some are saying is this was basically ready to go and be signed. That everyone had, yep, the people involved, this is what's going forward, and then was backed out. And like we spoke about, like the foreign minister said, basically that it was so ridiculous that they could not even think about being on the negotiating table. You'll see through this, well, what it says. You can make up your own mind. Great Britain, China, Russian Federation, United States, French Republic, Republic of Belarus, Republic of Turkey, being guarantors of the security of Ukraine as permanent neutral state. Guarantor states, Ukraine hereinafter referred to as the parties. Referring to the Declaration of State Sovereignty, Ukraine dated 16th July 1990, in particular the fact declaration, Ukraine solemnly proclaimed its intention of becoming a future permanent neutral state that does not take part in military blocs, aka NATO, and adheres to 3 non-nuclear principles: to accept, to produce, and to purchase no nuclear weapons. Being convinced that enshrining the permanent neutrality of Ukraine at the international legal level is an integral part of the long-term goal of maintaining international peace and security, including at the regional level agreed upon the following. Article 1. Ukraine undertakes to support its permanent neutrality, which is declared and enshrined in the Constitution of Ukraine. So Ukraine would have to undertake this as well, constitutionally. 2. The guarantor states recognise, respect and guarantee the states or a status of Ukraine as permanently neutral, and to undertake to ensure that this status is observed at international level. So they're not taking steps against it, and they are advising and looking on if Ukraine's taking steps ahead for that as well. 3A, not to engage in activities that would be contrary to the international legal status of permanent. B, terminate international treaties and agreements incompatible with permanent neutrality. So any agreements you've got other than this is then on top of those are then terminated. C, not to participate in military conflicts on the side of any guarantor state and or third state. So America goes to Afghan, Russia goes to Afghan, well, either side would lose probably a second time, but Ukraine then can't come into that conflict on the side of a guarantor state. D, not to join any military alliances, not to conclude military agreements, the implementation of which would contradict Articles 1 and 2. E, not to allow entry into the territory of Ukraine or deployment of any form of its territory, including temporarily of foreign weapons, missile systems, any type of armed forces formation. So no foreign military then on the ground. Is allowed to provide assistance to Ukraine on the basis of official requests from Ukraine for foreign military personnel without weapons to carry out civilian work for non-military activities, in particular to provide assistance in eliminating consequences of emergencies, natural or man-made disasters. So the first thing that comes to my mind in this is landmines. The second one is, say, like when I was in Turkey, when there's the horrible earthquake, military can deploy there, but not in an army sense. They're not there with You don't shoot at a bloody building that might collapse. F, to prevent the creation of presence of Ukraine of foreign military bases and other military infrastructure on the territory of Ukraine, refused to provide foreign states. So no military infrastructure bases to be there. Not allowed foreign states, military alliance or coalition to use for military purposes any infrastructure on the territory of Ukraine. H, without the consent of all guarantor states, not to conduct military exercises with the participation of foreign armed forces on the territory of Ukraine. Now, this was one of the sticking points that people talked about and that talks about. Without the consent of all the guarantor states. Of course, that includes the UK, US, Russia, that all of them need to agree. Now, this was one of the problems, and I've got this in green, so I remember. The biggest problem came in Article 5. It stated, in the event of another armed attack on Ukraine, we'll talk about Article 5, the guarantor states that would sign the treaty, Great Britain, China, Russia, US, and France, would come to Ukraine's defence. To Ukraine's dismay, there was a crucial departure on what Ukrainian negotiators said was discussed in Istanbul. Russia inserted a clause saying the guarantor states, including Russia, had to approve the response if Ukraine were attacked. So everyone would have to come to it. In effect, Moscow could invade Ukraine again and then veto any military intervention on Ukraine's behalf, a seemingly absurd condition that Kyiv quickly identified as a deal breaker. That said, I think, and one of my friends sent me to say that's probably not as simple as that. And he said this. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but NATO could have readied its troops on the borders of Ukraine and had all systems in place to protect Ukraine if it was ever in danger of being invaded again. Russia wouldn't be able to veto shit if it attacked, as the agreement would have been broken. So really the point that is about Article 5 that made Ukraine stop negotiating is ludicrous. Basically, what he's saying is, no, okay, that if Russia do invade, they're breaking then the agreement. Therefore, their side, their permission and their veto will then be null and void. We'll talk about more of that when we get to then Article 5. We're still in Article 1. Not to recruit citizens of foreign states, stateless persons into the armed forces of Ukraine. Of course, strictly complies with obligations of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation Nuclear Weapons Pact. Pursue in this article maximum number of personnel. We'll look at that in length. Respect and observe independence and sovereignty of Ukraine from the guarantor states and respect this, as well as other parties, to terminate international treaties and agreements that are incompatible with the permanent neutrality of Ukraine, not to enter into military alliances, to refrain from direct or indirect interference in any form of internal affairs of Ukraine, so not interfering in their own affairs regardless, to refrain from the threat of use of force against Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, refrain from using their territories or territories of other states to damage international legal status, permanently neutrality of Ukraine, not to bring into the territory of Ukraine or deploy any form territory of Ukraine, including temporarily, or any armed forces and formations and any weapons and missile systems. K, not to use any infrastructure on the territory of Ukraine for military purposes. Ukraine, its territorial waters and airspace for the transit of nuclear weapons, not to use, in accordance with Annex 4, not to take actions in violation of the basically CBRN, the chemical, biological, nuclear security on the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine and each of the states that are parties to the treaty do not consider each other as adversaries. All parties to the treaty mutually undertake and resolve all international disputes. Ukraine and the guarantor states shall maintain dialogue and interact on improving mechanisms to prevent incidents on and over the high seas. Article 3. The parties to this treaty share the understanding that Ukraine's status as a permanently neutral state is subject to provisions of this treaty, compatible with Ukraine's possible membership into the European Union, as well as participation in the UN, OSCE, or EU peacekeeping missions, and of course, possible membership into the EU. So this isn't then against this. And we talk a little bit about this in this one I've got. That this is the bit at the top that we just pulled out, but much of the treaty would not apply to Crimea and be determined as well to Ukraine, meaning Kyiv would accept Russian occupation as part of its territory without recognise Russian sovereignty over it. So it's a bit 50-50 here. Treaty doesn't apply to Crimea because Navy's there regardless. But Kyiv would accept that Russia then occupy it in that 10 or 15 years we spoke about, and then other negotiations forward outside of this. But it would be occupied, but doesn't recognise complete sovereignty over it. We'll talk about these weapon systems at the end and limits. Russia wanted the firing range of missiles to be 25 miles, while Ukraine wanted 174 miles, enough to hit targets in Crimea. That's why, obviously, they wanted that there. Maintain emergency hotline between the guarantor states. Now, Article 5, this is where we get very interesting. The guarantor states in Ukraine agree that in the event of an armed attack on Ukraine, each of the guarantor states, after holding urgent immediate consultations among them in the exercise of the right to individual collective self-defense. So under Article 51 of the United Nations, you can have self-defense. This would include closing the airspace of Ukraine, the provision of necessary weapons. Now, this was said in this one. That was the sticking point. That departure was from negotiations said discussing the spill. Russia inserted a clause, guarantor states, including Russia, had to approve the response when Ukraine were attacked. But again, like we've said, that Russia would void its ability to veto if it were the one that attacked in this. So again, I think there must have been something else, and maybe we're missing something in here. Article 6. The Russian Federation and Ukraine shall cancel all mutual sanctions, prohibitions and restrictive measures, including retaliatory measures introduced since 2014 against each other. So any restrictions that Russia had against Ukraine, Ukraine had against Russia, are then gone. The lifting of sanctions, prohibitions and restrictive measures in accordance with the article should be carried out regardless of the position and actions of states and their associates. So, of course, Russia wants those sanctions lifted up. Continue within a reasonable time. Intergovernmental Commission facilitating the settlement of investment property claims against Russian Federation by Ukrainian individuals and legal entities, as well as Russian individuals and legal entities against Ukraine. So both ways again. That the treaty shall not apply to Crimea or Sevastopol in the areas we spoke about that it would be recognised as occupied but not in the sovereign territory. Article 11, the timing for the procedure of ceasefire, withdrawal of troops and exchange of prisoners of war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine from the beginning of the provisional application of this treaty. So once it was through. Article 12, Ukraine shall guarantee that the Russian language is an official one and functions on an equal basis with the Ukrainian state language. Article 13, Ukraine shall condemn and ban all propaganda and all organisations based on ideas, theories of superiority of one race or group of persons of a certain skin colour or ethnic or a national origin, including the ideas of fascism, Nazism, neo-Nazism and aggressive nationalism. Article then 14, part 4 in here. In the event of a dispute regarding the interpretation or implementation of this treaty, the parties to the treaty are obliged to refrain from any decisions and or actions that may harm the permanent neutrality of Ukraine, its sovereignty and independence, or the subject matter of this treaty. Of course, this goes into if Russia were to reinvade. That would take away their veto for implementation of defence of the UK, China, Russia, UK, US, Russia, China, and rather 15. Reservations to the treaty by Ukraine, the guarantor states and other states that are parties to this treaty are not allowed. Article 16. 2. The treaty is subject to registration with the UN Secretariat in accordance with Article 102. I know I'm skipping a lot, but you can go look at this full thing yourself. Article 17. This treaty shall be provisionally applied from the date of its execution by Ukraine and the majority of guarantor states, including Russia. Now, we come down and we have a little bit of other stuff. Then we see that these are the maximum number of personnel, weapons, military equipment that are in combat composition of the armed force of Ukraine in peacetime. Does not exceed 250,000. That is still a massive military. When you look at like the Australian military, it's like 35,000, 800 tanks, 2,400 armoured vehicles, almost 2,000 guns and AT systems as well. Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, maximum engagement range of 75 kilometres. Anti-aircraft guns at 119 units. Man-pads at 600 units. Combat aircraft, combat 74, auxiliary 86. Now, some of these numbers are actually going to be, I believe, probably larger than Ukraine has currently. Helicopters, 144, including combat auxiliary. This is the breakup of the choppers. UAVs, of course, there's going to be UAV stuff after this war. It's going to be crazy. It's crazy during it. Warships with a displacement of 3,200 tons. So, bloody massive warships, combat boats, and blah, blah, blah. The maximum firing of MLRS, so multiple launch rocket system, and missile weapons of all types is no more than 280 kilometres. Ukraine undertakes not to develop, produce, or acquire or deploy on its territory or any type of missile system with a firing range of more than 280 kilometres. But National Guard troops are not allowed to have heavy weapons with the exemption of armoured fighting vehicles. The maximum firing range of MLRS and missile systems of all types is no more than 40 kilometres. So these were some of the problems we did see because, like we spoke about before, the ability to hit then Crimea. At the same time, it is allowed to develop and produce such weapons for export within the framework of the implementation of military technical cooperation and agreements that do not contradict provisions of this treaty, with a range of 40 kilometres but not more than 280 kilometres. So you can develop them, export, but not have them on your own land. List of laws of Ukraine regarding the language, on ensuring the functioning of Ukrainian language as the state language. And then we have a bunch of other laws down here. Laws of Nazification and glorification of Nazism, condemn communist, nationals, Nazi, totalitarian regimes in Ukraine, the ban of propaganda and their systems, the commemoration of victory over Nazism in the Second World War, of course, the dates of the Second World War, the rehabilitation of victims of the repression of the communist totalitarian regime, Soviet Union. Here, the legal status honouring the memory of fighters for the independence of Ukraine in the 20th century. Now, clarifications, obligations to the party in field, chemical, biological safety, to strictly comply with obligations under the Convention of Prevention, so the CWC, prohibition in the development, stockpiling, so this is all under the CWC, which we know both Ukraine and Russia have broken with the use of those K-51 riot control grenades. To ensure the interest guarantor states carry out verification activities on an annual basis with bilateral format with Ukraine in relation to what's set out in these subparagraphs. Strictly comply with CWC, as we spoke about, the guarantor states and other states parties to the treaty undertake not to take actions that undermine Ukraine's compliance with the obligation under these. So keeping each other, not breaking it. Number one, the Russian Federation and Ukraine take measures to separate the parties and do not carry out actions that could lead to the expansion of the territory controlled by them or cause resumption of hostilities. So not to expand what you're doing or to start it again. Now, 2, Ukraine carries out withdrawal return of units of armed forces, other armed formations, weapons, military equipment to place of permanent deployment or to places agreed upon by the Russian Federation. The procedure of timing for the withdrawal by the Russian Federation units of armed forces and armed formations of weapon and military equipment outside the territory indicated on the map. Now, interestingly, we don't have this map. This is the map we want to see. Annex 6 is not included. That's what we want to see. What is the map? Where is things going back to? What's the permanent deployment areas? And what would actually be occupied? The exchange of bodies of the dead and the release of all prisoners of war and interned civilians shall be carried out as soon as possible in participation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. So that is all that we have. I think that's very interesting. There doesn't seem anything like, I was expecting more massive sticking points on this. I'm not saying that it is fair or just or whatever, whichever side you look at it. But as far as that it's completely ridiculous, that you could never think about it, I don't know. And the guarantor thing, what seems to be the large sticking point in here, would be compromised if Russia did re-invade. So it's just interesting. It'll be interesting to see if there's a response to this from Ukraine or from Russia. So I guess we'll look through it. It's interesting to look at. You can go look at it yourself. It's downloadable in multiple language, everything you'd want to see. So, oh my God, I need a cough. I hope you're having a good night. And I'll speak to you tomorrow. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.